great. We are recording. Good, great. Let's go back to the screen share, or try to get back to the screen share then. There we are. Okay. So we're back in business. So Tov ayin hu yavorach, a person with a goodly eye, he should be blessed. Ki nosni lachmei ladol, he's given from his own bread to the poor. And the beautiful idea in this is that the gift of the eye, the gift of sight, as Shlomo Melech expressed it here in Mishlei, is that when when you are able to appreciate that whatever resource you have to hand, you share with others, that is the Tov Ayin, that is the goodliness of the eye. And on the other hand, as we find in the Mishnah in Perek, when Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai has 5 Talmidim and he asks them to go and see what's the best thing a person can do, the worst thing a person can cleave to as a midah, as an attribute in life. So one of the great Talmidim, Rei Loza, says that the good midah is ayin tova, is a goodly eye, and the bad midah, the opposite of that, is an ayin ra, we might call it in English a jaundiced eye, a prejudiced eye. So the first thing I want to do in understanding the importance of sight and the way in which it's utilized is to look at 3 different verbs in the Torah for seeing and their implications. So source number 1 on page 1 in the source sheet is Vayero Elav Hashem be'Elohim Mamre, the beginning of this week's parsha. Hashem appeared to him in the plains of Mamre. He was sitting at the entranceway to his tent in the heat of the day. Vayisoino Vayar. He lifted up his eyes and he saw. There were 3 men standing literally over him. Now the pasuk says Vayisoino Vayar, so he's seen them. And then if you look, that's line number 1 in source number 1. Go to the beginning of line number 2. Vayar, it says again, and he saw them. Vayar tzlikrosom, he ran to greet them. Pesach oil vayishtach arza. Says Rashi straight away, picking up on the double usage of Vayar. Mau Vayar Vayar shnei pa'omim. Why does it say in the pasuk twice he saw them? You've told me the beginning of the pasuk. Vayiso'eno Vayar, he lifted up his eyes and he saw. Why do you need to tell me again Vayar? Says Rashi, Harishon Kamashmoy. The first one is just as you would understand it. It's simple application. Vasheni, the second one, is a Loshen Havana, is an expression of understanding. Nistakel, by the way, that's another expression of seeing something, which I don't actually deal with so much in the shir, but you'll see, and as we go through the shir, you'll see there are many different ways of expressing the verb to see in Hebrew. Interesting, nistakel can also be connected to the word sochel, which can mean foolishness and can also mean to be clever in a certain way. As sochel, you can, in the samach and the sin, interchangeable. Seichel is also connected to that, but that depends on the way that you apply vision, whether it is something which is of beneficial purpose or something which is a stupidity. So nistakel shoyin nitzom b'mokem echad. Avram Avinu saw these 3 angels who present themselves as men standing in one place. Ve'havin shlo hayu rotzim latricha. He understood they didn't want to trouble him. Even they knew that he would go out to greet them. They remained stationary, for his honor, out of respect for Avram Avinu. To show him they didn't want to trouble him. And therefore Avram Avinu, he took the initiative, he ran to greet them. Now, this already tells us something about sight. I can see something and I can see something. To see and to see. The first Vayar is almost something where we have no idea how many different images our eyes are communicating to our brain through the complex system of that which is sight, through the lens of the eye, through the pupils of the eye, going back through all of the different elements of the eye until the brain actually receives the image, and we know how it works. Like a camera needs to be turned around. Absolutely fascinating, the physiology of the eye-brain connection. But Vayar, there's some things we see and we don't even realize we've seen them. And then Vayar, They're seeing something which, as Rashi explains it here, means Havin Shleyosu Lashricha. He understands the subtext, he understands that which isn't written, which isn't explicit, and therefore he now takes the initiative and goes out to greet them. A second expression of seeing, which I've described as to look, Vayokum Mishom Hanoshim Vayashkif al Pnei Sodom. The source number 2, the bottom of page 1. The men got up and they looked towards Sodom. The Avram Halech Imam L'Shalchim. Avram went with them to send them on their way. Says Rashi, Kol Hashkofa Shebemikra L'Ra. Generally, the word Hashkofa, which is a more intense form, perhaps, than merely seeing. Normally, when you find the word Hashkif, Hashkafa in the Torah, it means something, denotes something which is negative. Apart from one exception, and that's in Parshas Kisaveh, as part of the Mikra Bikurim, as part of the recitation of the expression of gratitude with which a person brought their first fruits to Yerushalayim. What the part of that is Hashkifo in Kodshecho, asking Kodesh Baruch to look down from your holy place. So what Rashi is asking really is Hashkifo is inappropriate in that situation. So he says, why is Hashkofa used in the context of the bringing of Habas Bikurim, bringing of first fruits? Shegodol kach matnasanim shefich midas hareg zerachmim. For so great is the gift of bringing gifts to the poor that it turns the attribute, divine attribute of anger to one of mercy, from wrath to one of mercy. Turning over now onto page 2. Just move down on the screen a little bit, and there we have page 2. So that's two expressions, therefore, or two words of seeing, liros, re'iyah, and hashkafa. Third element now in source number 3 is Vayhi chayitziam oisam hachutza. It was when he brought them outside. This refers to the malach, the angel, who has come to save Lot and his family from the destruction of Sodom and its allied cities, the 5 cities around Sodom, together with Amorah, etc. So he takes them outside. He says, "Flee for your lives. Al tabit acharecha. Don't gaze behind you. Don't stand still. Don't stop anywhere on the plain. Hahora himalate. Flee to the mountain. Penti sofa, lest you'll be consumed." And of course, the Pasuk goes on to famously record in Pasuk Chavav, verse 26, that same chapter 19 in Bereshis, "V'atabet ishta me'acherav." The wife of Lot looked behind her, gazed behind her towards the destruction of the Amorah. "V'atihi netziv melach," and she became a pillar of salt. Now, Rashi explains in these two places, first of all, what's the significance al tabit acharecha? Don't gaze behind you. Atohir shauta imoim, says Rashi, line 3 in source 3. You behaved badly, you an evil person, together with the people of Sodom, uvischus avram atonitzel, and you're being saved, you Lot, and those who are with you are being saved in the schus of Mavinu. In other words, you haven't got your own ticket to travel. You're not traveling on your own merits. You're not being saved your own merits. You're not worthy enough to be able to gaze on the punishment being meted out to inhabitants of Sodom and Amorah, and that you should be saved. So to gaze upon something, you have to have a certain degree of earned right. And this was something which Lot and his family didn't have. Furthermore, says Rashi, she became a pillar of salt. She sinned with salt and she was punished with salt. Lot had said to his wife, this is a Medrash Bereshis Rabbah Nun Daled, chapter 50, subparagraph 4. He said to give the visitors a little bit of salt. And she said, you're going to try and introduce this sort of wicked practice, you're going to try and turn around Sodom into being a place of chesed. This was the attitude of Lot's wife, and therefore she wasn't entitled. She didn't have a zechus kiyum. She certainly didn't have a right to remain alive, to be safe from the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, other than as ancillary to Avram Avinu, as an adjunct to Avram Avinu, and therefore she looked back, but she gazed upon the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. That was something she wasn't entitled to do. So three different explanations, three different words here to see liros, and then we had the second expression, which was hashkafa, and the third expression habota, and I'm taking them at the moment on the basis of the sources we've looked at as different levels of seeing, looking, and gazing, increasing levels of intensity. Now, in source number 4, we see habota in a positive sense, and this is when HaKadosh Baruch Hu turns to Avram Avinu and he takes him outside and he says, "Habet no hashamayim usvara kachovim." Go outside and count the stars. If you're able to count them, he tells him, "Ko yezarecha." Thus will be your descendants. And Rashi says there, last week said, this is Rashi says, what's the explanation? What's the meaning of look up at the heavens, gaze up at the heavens? This is again the intensity of looking at something. It doesn't just mean to look, to see. To gaze means with an intensity when you consider the implications, when you look with profundity. So Habet no hashamayim, look up at the heavens, count the stars if you're able to count them. And HaKadosh Baruch says to him, thus shall be your descendants. Says Rashi there, he took him out almost from the embrace, from the encompass of the world. He took even above the stars. And this tells you the extent of the word habota we use as one of our supplications over Yom Neroim and elsewhere in Slichas. Habet no hashamayim urei, this expression of habet no hashamayim, to look right up to the very heavens, to the vault of heavens, to the highest most point, and see. Habot is milmala lamata, being able to gaze down from the highest point, and if you like, bringing the influence of that highest point down to the lowest point here on earth. So that's the profound impact of habota, of sight. And by the way, again, I didn't bring down the sources. There's just so much more to talk about on this element of sight, to see or not to see, as we'll see. And we're dealing here with the hashkafic at the moment, perhaps more than the halachic implications. But one of the things that we find as well is that it says about Odom Arishon, Kodem Achet, Adam Rishon, when he's first created prior to the sin of eating from the fruit in the Garden of Eden, was Ra'ah Misofa Eilam Ad Sofa. With his vision, he was able to encompass, to see the entirety of the world. One can either be short-sighted or long-sighted. I don't just mean in the optical sense, but I mean in terms of the limitation of one's vision, or what vision can encompass. And there is no greater span of vision than from the highest levels of the heavens. Let's just get this clear. It's one of my favorite masholim to quote. In the 1970s, the Americans, NASA sent 2 spacecraft to reach interstellar space, Voyager 1 and Voyager 2. They're currently traveling at something like, I think it's 60,000 miles or kilometers an hour, and it will still take them 40,000 years to reach the first star. And here we're talked about that HaKadosh Baruch Hu took him mechaloloi shel olim bigbiu lamala min ha'kochovim. It just tells you how far that vision of Habet Noah is able to encompass. Quite remarkable. Now I want to look at a third example of habota, of this most intense element of gazing. And this comes from Bamidbar Chaf Aleph, where we have the episode of Klal Yisrael being threatened by this outbreak of poisonous snakes. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Moshe Rabbeinu in source number 5, take for yourself, make for yourself a serpent and place it high up on a banner. It will be anybody who sees it, anyone who's bitten, he will see it and live. Now, I've put in bold V'ra Oisoi for good reason. V'ra Oisoi, if he sees it. It then goes on to say, Vayas Moshe Nechash Nechoshes, Moshe Rabbeinu made the copper serpent, Vayisimei alanes, he placed it high up on this banner, on pole, Vayom Noshach HaNochosh Es Ish, it will be, if the serpent will bite a person, v'hibit, that person will gaze upon the Nechash Nechoshes, on the copper serpent, V'chai, and he will live. Now, of course, the Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah famously tells us that the nochosh memis nochosh mechaye, is it the nochosh which is going to give life or not give life, this copper serpent, some sort of magical experience here with looking on this copper serpent? And he says no, elo kolzman shemistaklin Yisrael klapi maila, as long as the Jewish people turned their eyes heavenwards, that's what the copper serpent did. It got them to lift up their vision and look up to the heavens. Then hoyu misrapin, then they would be healed. In love, and if not, hoyu nimoikin, then they would unfortunately not experience the healing process and would go downhill. Now Rashi makes the following diak. V'ra Eisai, the first posuk we quoted, posuk Ches, Bamidbar Chafalef, that says V'ra Hoyaka Noshuch. Can you see the first line of source 5? Hoyaka Noshuch. Anyone who was bitten would look at or would see the serpent and live. And yet it says with the noshach hanochosh, if the serpent were to bite a person, then vehibit, ra was not sufficient, re'ir wasn't sufficient. It had to be habota. Says Rashi, what are we talking about? Rashi says earlier, I haven't actually brought it down here in writing, but Rashi says earlier, what's the V'ra say? Rashi says it could be a dog, it could be an animal, whatever, etc. Any other bite, Re'iyah alone was sufficient, just to see the copper serpent, a quick look up heavenwards, and he'd be healed. But here, when it comes in the second posuk test to speak about the bite of the serpent, it says v'hibit, you've got to gaze upon it. Because a serpent with the poisonous venom that it injects into the veins of the human being, it's not so easy to recover from a serpent's bite. And we know that if within minutes, if it's a particularly virulent venom, you know that within minutes, if you don't get the antidote into the body, it's too late. So it's much harder to be healed from the serpent's bite. So therefore, it wasn't sufficient just to see the copper serpent. As I've again put in bold in the English as well, to be healed from the serpent's bite, one needs to gaze upon it with concentration. So that's habota, which is the most intense form of looking. Now in source number 6, I'm going back a parsha even a bit earlier. See, we've been learning the parsha as well. Going back to Parshas Noach now. We've looked at Vayar from Vayera. We've looked at Vayotze from Lech Lecha. Now, an interesting little observation in Soatar Salateva, which I actually used as my 3-minute Devar Torah in the early minyan and Parshas Noach a couple of weeks ago. Sadly, it doesn't look like we're going to be able to do that anytime soon again, to actually have Tefillah B'tzibur on the Shabbos morning with even the briefest of Divrei Torah. Tzoya Ta'aseh Lateva. Do you remember the Tzoya, the source of light that was within the ark that Noach made? And Rashi brings down there a very famous difference of opinion. Yesh Omrim Chalon, some say it was a window in the Teva. V'yesh Omrim Even Tova Me'ir Lehem, and others say it was a precious, a good stone which gave light for them. This is a Medrash Rabbah. And I'm now quoting in source 6 from a vort of Rabbi Yosef Feimer of Slutsk, which is quoted in the Sefer Mishuchan Gavaya, who gives an explanation as to the two different opinions of Chalon and Even Tova. He says, it would appear that the difference of opinion as to whether in the Teva they got their light naturally from a window or whether it was a special precious stone which gave the light is dependent on the machlokes of whether Noach was a pure tzaddik or a flawed tzaddik, as it were. If to expound this to the praise or to the detriment of Noach. According to that opinion, that actually it's to the shame, the detriment of Noach that he's called a tzaddik b'derosav, a righteous person in his generation, meaning only in his generation he was righteous. Just like Lot and his wife and those who went with him were not allowed to see the downfall of Sodom. And he was instructed, don't gaze behind you. Likewise, Noach was not allowed to have a chaloin, a window in the teva, that he should not see what was going on outside. He wasn't allowed to gaze upon the downfall of the evil people in his generation. Going now on to page 3. And therefore, Sivo lahamid even tova hameiro kadei lahem. That's why I was instructed to put a precious stone in some point in the side or the roof of the teva to give them light. But according to the opinion that he was a righteous individual, purely righteous individual, Noach, so according to that, that's why I needed to have a window in the ark, or could have a window in the ark. He was given permission to see the downfall of Rishonim, as we find with Avram Avinu, about whom it says, in this week's Sedra, he was able to gaze upon, to look at the destruction of where Sodom had been previously. This is the dispensation that's given to Avram Avinu as a tzaddik, and that's the possibility that there was a chalona window which not only admitted light into the teva, but also allowed them to see what was going on in the world outside to some extent. So there again, you see the difference between limited vision, as I put it in the summary, the outline, light for all, but unrestricted vision for the righteous. And that also gives us an understanding of the posuk, which is perhaps best well known to us from the introduction to Kol Nidre. Light is sown for the righteous. Light is there for the righteous. We know the same thing, that at the time of Bereshis, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu saw that the world wouldn't remain in a purely righteous form, he took the original pure light which he had created, the gonzola tzadikim na'osed lovei, and he stored it away. He put it, if you like, he mothballed it. He put it away into storage until the time when it would be possible for tzadikim to benefit from that light. So one more source before we come to the halachic implications of Re'iyah, which itself is fascinating, and that is also from this week's parasha, actually from the Akedah. Source number 7 on page 3. Bayom HaShlishi, it was the third day. Vayisa Avram Esinov, Avram lifted up, raised his eyes, Vayares Hamoka Mirochik, and he saw the place from afar. Vayomer Avraham El Naorov, Avram said to his lads who accompanying him, Yishmael and Eliezer, Shvu lachem payim hachamer, you stay here with the donkey, Va'ani va'ana nelcha ad kai, I and the young man, referring to Yitzchok, will go till there, v'nishtachaveh, will bow down, v'nushuv aleichem, will return to you. In the Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer that I quote in the continuation of this source 7, Perek Lamed Aleph, there is a fascinating expansion of that which is recorded in the Pasuk. It says that Avram Avinu saw the place from afar, and then suddenly he tells Yishmael to stay here, and Yitzchok and I are going to proceed. What actually caused Avraham Avinu to take that decision to tell Yishmael, Eliezer and Yishmael the journey ended for them there, and that he and Yitzchok were to proceed further? Let's look at the Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, who will explain it all, and then we'll also understand an element of the Re'iyah, of the sight of Avraham Avinu, to see or not to see. Some people see things, some people do not see things. Pirkei actually read a beautiful thing just in this context about someone who was privileged to spend time with the Chofetz Chaim, and he said, for those who understood who the Chofetz Chaim was, you could see everything. For those who didn't understand who he was, you saw nothing. A fascinating idea. The same idea we find actually reflected in the Pasuk in Tehillim. Urei betuv Yerushalayim kol yemei chayecha, urei von levanecha shalom Yisrael. You want to see, as we all want to see, children's children and peace on Israel. Urei betuv Yerushalayim. See the good of Yerushalayim. You can complain Yerushalayim is a place which is, it's a very hilly place. It's difficult to get there. It's difficult to defend. Everyone wants it. We can find a more comfortable place to live. Orei betuv Yerushalayim. See the kedusha of Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim horim sovivla. Vashem sovivla amamiatov. Olam as David HaMelech says elsewhere in Tehillim, Yerushalayim is surrounded by hills, representative of the way that Hashem surrounds His people. And you understand that the beauty of Yerushalayim. The Gemara in Kiddushin says about Asor Kabin Shel Yofi Yodon Olam. I've given 2 shiurim on this around the time of Yom Yerushalayim. That 10 measures of beauty came down to the world. 9 were taken by Yerushalayim. And you understand that beauty to be beauty of ruchnius, of spirituality, as well as physical beauty. And you understand how to look at Yerushalayim. Then Yerushalayim will provide you with the gifts and the blessings of Vonim Levanecha, children's children, Shalom Yisrael, peace in Israel, the most heartfelt gifts. But you've got to look in the right way. Let's have a look here about how Avraham Avinu and Yitzchak Avinu looked at things, and how Yishmael and Eliezer looked at things, and the difference between them. Says the Pirkei Eliezer, beginning line 3 in source 7. Vayisa Avraham Bayem HaShlishi, the 3rd day, Higiu LeTzofim. They reached Scopus, Tzofim. Why is it called Mount Scopus? To look out. Like a telescope, right? You look out, Scopus. It's a lookout, a point from which you can see things. They reached Tzofim. They're given Shigir L'Tzofim. Once they reached Scopus, from which they could look out to Rabbi, to the Temple Mount, Ra Kovod Hashchina Omed Gabi Hahar. Avraham Avinu saw the honor, the splendor, the glory of the Shechina, divine presence, standing on top of the mountain. Shema, it says, Vayom HaShlishi, it was the 3rd day. Vayisa Avraham es Einov, Avraham lifted up, raised his eyes. Vayares hamokom meirochaik, he saw the place from afar. He saw. The vision that Avraham saw was covered Hashchina Omed Alahor. Ma Ra'ah, says the Pirkei Eliezer, line 4. Ma Ra'ah, what did he see? Ra Amud Shel Eish Min Haaretz Ad Shamayim. He saw a pillar of fire extending from the earth to the heavens. And for crying out loud, a pillar of fire from the heavens, from the earth to the heavens, it's pretty hard to miss it, isn't it? So he saw it. Omar li Yitzchak, Benoi, he says to Yitzchak, his son, Beni, my son, Roya ata klum be'echo min hahorim halolu. He says, do you see anything on any of these mountains? For goodness sake, how far is it from Scopus to Rabbi? Literally the next mountaintop. How can you miss it? Do you see any of these mountains? Amalehen. He said to him, yes. Amaloi, Avraham Avinu says to Yitzchak, Ma toroy, what do you see? Amaloi ani roya amud shel eish omed min haaretz v'ad hashamayim. I see a pillar of fire extending from the very earth to the very heavens. At that point, Avraham Avinu appreciated someone who sees what I see, and he's my son, and he's younger, and he sees this pillar of fire. He is acceptable. He is someone who is desired as an olah, as an offering. Okay, so Avraham has seen it. He didn't ask leading questions. He just said, do you see anything? He didn't say, do you see that pillar of fire over there? He said, do you see anything? And Yitzchak, yes, I see the pillar of fire. Omar Yishmael Eliezer, continuing on in the Pirkei Eliezer now, the 3rd, 4th last line in source 7. He says, Yishmael Eliezer, Roim atem klum be'echo min hahor halolu. Do you see anything on any one of these mountains? Omru lo lav. They said, no, we don't see anything. He sort of settled them like donkeys. He said to them, you stay here with the donkey. Amar lahem, Keshem she'ena chamor royeh klum, kach atem einam roim klum. Just like the chamor doesn't see anything, so you don't see anything. Now, by the way, chamor is fascinating because chamor is connected to the word chemer, and chemer is the ultimate in Gashmius. It's the raw physical material of this world. That's the idea of the chamor, the beast of burden. Is the chamor is made from chemer, and therefore Avram Avinu this is not racial profiling. God forbid, in this 21st century age, we should have to defend such a heinous practice. But it's not racial profiling, and it's not discriminatory. It's just simply someone does see something, then you belong in that place. Someone doesn't see something, you belong somewhere else. So he says, this is the right place for you, and I and Yitzchak, we will proceed further because we've perceived, you haven't perceived. Shema, as it says, you stay with the donkey. You're comparable to the chamor, not in that the expression they say in Yiddish, a person is described as a chamakop. You've got a head like a donkey. That's not chas v'sholem what we're saying here in sort of slang that they're chamorim. What we're saying to them is, you're people who are megushomim, you are made from chemer, you are like the chamor, you don't have this vision. So vision is also dependent, and we'll see this later on, much later on in the Shia, about how the heart drives the eyes as much as the eyes drive the heart. We'll come on to that concept a little bit later on in the outline. I've discussed that, and we'll come on to it in source number 15, almost at the end of the Shia. Now we're going to move to the halachic area, having seen how much there is to see in terms of what re'iyah, what hashkofa, and what habota are all about, different types of sight, and how our seeing is connected to a level of perception which is based upon a level of spirituality, a level of accomplishment, a level of achievement. Now we're going to look at the fact that re'iyah, sight, seeing, looking at something, which appears to be something which doesn't have any physical consequence. It's not tangible. I look at something, so what have I done? I haven't changed the object, but we'll see that sight has halachic implications. And there is a fascinating sugya at the beginning of Maseches Bava Basra, which talks about whether Hezek Re'iyah is Shemei Hezek or Lav Shemei Hezek. Can I be deemed to have damaged your property by looking at it? By looking at something? Now, I remember many years ago, we were in Manchester, we had a bit of a flood in our area, in the subfloor area of the house, and other houses were also affected. There was a problem with the way that water was running, someone had a blocked pipe, whatever, etc., and it flooded people's subfloor. And the insurance company sent round loss adjusters to consider everybody's situation. And I remember our loss adjuster being a little bit woebegone, and he said, look, you clearly have suffered inconvenience and your subfloor has been flooded, but you've actually not got any damage to the fabric of your house. So there's nothing which is actionable here. There is nothing here which you can claim for. It will dry out, and it's only the subfloor, and sort of Shalom Al Yisrael. That was the end of the story, as it were. What about Re'iyah? If I overlook your property, if I stand and gaze upon your property, am I damaging it in some way? Can I claim, for example, when I live with a neighbor, and it's very interesting, we live in a neighborhood where everyone is familiar with fences and the garden and how to be able to work out according to the deeds, and even according to the way that the battens run on the fences, whose responsibility it is to maintain a fence or a garden wall, etc. But there are other areas in the world where people live with open gardens, just simply running into one another, and it's part of the beauty of their sort of open living and shared open spaces, they describe it. So here we have a situation in source number 8, which is discussed in the Gemara in Bava Basra, based on the principle of whether Hezek Re'iyah Shmei Hezek or Lav Shmei Hezek, whether my or your looking into your or my property is considered to be an actionable damage or not. So Chotzer Shutfin source number 8, a courtyard which is jointly owned. Sheyesh Bodin Chaluka, which is possible it's large enough. There's a difference of opinion in the poskim exactly how big a courtyard has to be considered divisible, but either it's a courtyard which is considered to be large enough that it can be divided into two or more parts. Alternatively, you can go around sometimes and see little cottages, small houses which have got tiny little gardens, and yet each one is like its own little enchanted garden walled in its own right. So even though it's too small an area to be entitled to Chalukah, but all of the residents agree they prefer to have walled-in gardens or yards. Each party within that development is entitled to force their fellow to build a wall along the midpoint between the two courtyards. Why? So in bold, I've put this bottom of page number 3 going to page 4 in English. That you shouldn't be able to see what I'm doing in my garden, and I shouldn't be able to see what you're doing in your garden. It's privacy. It's part of, we'll see some of the reason for this later on, but there is a halacha, kedei shelo yir'eu chaverei. Just simply, your friend should not be able to see what you're doing in your garden. You're entitled to your privacy, as it were. That's what we seem to be saying here. And therefore, even if for many, many years, the courtyard has been undivided by any partition, there is discussion in the Achronim as to whether, like we have in English law, a rule whereby if something has been unchallenged for a period of years, maybe 3 years, maybe 7 years, whatever it may be, by virtue of usage, is it now deemed to be a common area which cannot be divided? But La Halacha here is saying in Shulchan Aruch that you can divide it b'cholei shirtza. Hagar, says the Ramah in a note here, this principle of putting up a partition, putting up a visual or perhaps a non-visual, an opaque divide between two parts of a courtyard is something which is so important that even if in that particular city there is a convention, a minhag, a practice not to put up walls or barriers, we force one to put up the wall. Even if the other party says, look, I love this open plan living. I love the fact that we've got a big unbounded area of greenery which we can all enjoy together as sort of a collective, almost like a park. And I established my time here without a wall, and you were prepared to forgive me. You were prepared to forego your right to a wall. Loi mahane, it doesn't help. Elim ken yesh edim shemochlu zelo ze al hezek re'iyah. Unless there are witnesses that they actually were prepared to concede to one another the damage caused by being able to see one another's property. So Re'iyah, sight alone, is significant enough to see or not to see. It's actionable only if there are witnesses that they actually granted one another's permission. Then Shuven Yechoyim Liros. This is a Torah B'Shem Rosh, brought down Halacha by Shulchan Aruch Mishpat Kuf Nun Zayin Aleph. Going now on to source sheet 4, the English you had at the top there, just of the piece I've just gone through with you from Shulchan Aruch. In source number 9, we'll see that the Rambam, Maimonides, brings down in fact, it's the other way around. The Rambam precedes the Shulchan Aruch. Rambam was about 1200. The Shulchan Aruch Yisukara was in the 1600s. So the Shulchan Aruch is based on the Lashon Rambam. But I bring down the Rambam, even though it's quite repetitive, and it's the source for the Shulchan Aruch we just read. But there's one very important extra phrase in the Rambam. So the Rambam's talking, as was Shulchan Aruch, about Chotze HaShutvin, Sheyesh Botin Chaluka, a courtyard of partners with dimensions large enough to be divided, or it was divided by common consent, even though it wasn't something which could officially you could demand division. Each party can demand of their fellow to build the wall, the partition in the middle. With his friend should not be able to see him when he's using his part of the courtyard. Shehezek re'iyah hezeku. My good friend, or not so good friend, the loss assessor, the loss adjuster, who told me I hadn't suffered any actual damage, needed to learn this particular Shulchan Aruch, Hezek Re'iyah Hezeku. I'm not saying it would help me in the case of some of damages that were caused by partial flooding, which then disappeared, but it is possible something which is non-tangible can be deemed to be damaged, and we'll see a reason why as well. Hezek Re'iyah Hezeku. Damages, and we'll try to quantify a little bit later on what damage is there in me looking at what you're doing. What damage is there? Hezek Re'iyah Hezeku. The Rambam there is, of course, just saying we saw the Shulchan Aruch, but I wanted to bring down this point because it paskins the Gemara there in Bava Basra at the beginning about whether Hezek Re'iyah Shmei Hezek or Lav Shmei Hezek, whether damage caused by gazing upon something, looking at something is damage or not. Clearly, the Rambam holds Hezek Re'iyah Shmei Hezek. In the next source, source number 10, we'll now see why see something that the Rashba, one of the early Rishonim, says about the damage again of Hezek Re'iyah, which reinforces that which we've just seen in the Rambam. Mikol Mokum says the Shuvas Rashba Chedi Beis Siman Reish Samaches, sorry, he says that in Nogu Shelo Lahakpid Klal Al Hezek Re'iyah, if the minhag was not to be particular about Hezek Re'iyah, visual damage, so you're living in an open sort of society, an open community where you've all got lovely flowing gardens which seamlessly roll into one another. So they were not particular about Hezek Re'iyah Shalabatim Ba'achatzeris. They weren't fussed about having fences between demarking the lines of each and every person's property and garden and house. Minhag betosu ve'ena minhag. Says the Rashba, this is a mistaken practice, and it doesn't even constitute a practice. You know, sometimes people think about various things that we do being considered as minhagim, and they were just a way of practice. There was a famous story told by one of Dayan Entro Shliti, he should only be well, please God, one of his holy ancestors who in his shul, they sort of developed a minhag that just before Anim Zmiros, someone would go up and put their hand behind the parechus for a few minutes, a few seconds, put them behind the parechus, and only after that they'd actually open the ark for Anim Zmiros. So no one understood where this minhag came from. Eventually they decided to turn and ask the Rav, why have we established this minhag that before we open the Oren for Anus Miras, we put our hand? He said, I don't know. He said, I don't know. And then he burst out laughing. He said, I'll tell you why. He said, people probably noticed we often give Psich of Anus Miras to the children, to younger children. He says, and the cord to open the Oren, the Pareches, is a little bit high up. He says, so I used to put my hand behind just before the boy would come up to open a little away, to pull the cord down, to make it easier for the boy to open the pareiches. And there you've got a minhag suddenly established. You've got to put your hand behind the pareiches for a few seconds before you actually open it. Right? It's just a practical thing. It wasn't a minhag. Says the Rashba, this is not a minhag. Says the Rashba even more strongly, she'ein mechula ha'akpoda ela b'mamonos, because such a concern cannot be foregone other than through financial compensation. A person is allowed to, with his own money, you can spend in the way that you want to do so. People spend money on all sorts of crazy ideas. It's your money, you can do with it what you like. You may have a din v'cheshbon with the Almighty that you didn't do more valuable things with your money, but you can do what you like. Says the Rashba, though, but you're not permitted, if you haven't actually sold your rights to putting up a fence, you're not allowed to simply reject established Jewish enactments and to behave in a manner which is immodest. So actually we begin to see that the concept of hezek re'iyah, of damaging by sight, isn't just simply a matter, as we said, of hezek re'iyah, of something which is a little bit ephemeral, difficult to define. Now the Rashba's told us something interesting. It's a lack of tznius. You know, what goes on in my home, I know in this day and age of 24/7 social media coverage, etc., 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 it's very difficult to have lives of privacy. But actually, every person who doesn't build their inner world is actually failing to develop themselves to become the great person that we're all supposed to become. It's not just about the image you convey out there. It's not living your life as people so very sadly do today, by the public acclaim, by how many hits you get on your website or your YouTube site or your Instagram or your Snapchat or whatever else these things may be that are doing the rounds today. That's not called living. And you see what miserable lives very often these so-called social influencers they live, and even more sadly, how they often, unfortunately, die early because they're unfulfilled, and sometimes even tragically die at their own hands because they feel completely empty inside. Rahman al-Islam. And the whole idea of hezek re'iyah, as the Rashba is explaining it here, is he's saying to us that you don't look at what your fellow's doing. Don't live my life. Don't live my life as your life. I don't want to live your life as my life. We all need to live our own lives, and we need that space. And that's what the Rashba is saying. Should have put that in bold, actually. That's one of the roots of hezek re'iyah is that hezek re'iyah, looking at what everyone else is doing, is a source of damage. Now, I bring down the source of the Aruch HaShulchan much later. The Aruch HaShulchan was the father of the Torah Tzemima, of Rabbi Michael Epstein was the Aruch HaShulchan. His son Rabbi Baruch Levi Epstein was the author of the Torah Tzemima. So he says, early 20th century, he quotes the following from the Gemara in Bava Metzia that we're going to look in a bit more detail in a moment. Chein also like Hazik B'Riyosov v'Chayv Nishmaim im Hizik Be'ein Maboto leChaveroi. It's also forbidden to damage by looking at somebody through one's vision. One's considered culpable in terms of Dinei Shemaim. You can't go to Beis Din and sue a person for having looked at your property. But Dinei Shemaim, in Hizik Be'ein Mabot L'Chaver, if you cause damage by gazing at what your fellow is doing, by sort of hovering over and gazing your fellow's property. Chazal say, also, this is Gemara and Bava Metzia, we're going to look at in a moment, also, don't stand gazing at the person's field when it's ripe and ready to be reaped, because you're looking at the field that's about to be harvested. Oh, what a nice field he's got. Oh, Shema, very nice field, etc. Any other forms of damage by viewing are forbidden, as looking upon what a person's doing in his house or in his garden, his courtyard, as I've written in Simon Kufn and Daled. The reason I bring this down here is because I put it in bold that the Aruch HaShulchan brings us down in Choshe Mishpat Siman Shin Ayin Ches Hilchas Nazikin, the laws of damages. The Rambam before was in Hilchas Shechenim, laws of neighborly behavior, but this is in laws of damage. Looking inappropriately at another person's property is actually Hilchas Nazikin, the Aruch HaShulchan is saying. It's not just a matter of good neighborly behavior, it's actually damages. Now, just looking a little bit further in source number 12, going on to page 5, which I've just brought up on the screen share as well, says Rabbi Abaum, Rabbi Vunam Rav, also the Gemara, which was quoted by the Aruch HaShulchan previously from Bava Metzia Kuf, saying you shouldn't stand by your fellow's field when looking at it. Rashi, the supreme commentator and pretty much rationalist, says, Shelo yafsideno, 4 words, incredible words, line 2 of source 12, Lo yafsideno ba'ayin hara. You shouldn't destroy it, you shouldn't damage it, you shouldn't cause loss by looking with a jaundiced eye at the beautiful harvest that your fellow is about to enjoy. I'm not saying this is the Ayin Hora, the classic Ayin Hora that we talk about, but Ayin Hora means a jealous, jaundiced, a prejudicial eye. Don't look at your fellow. I remember something beautiful. One of our neighbors said here that the road, there was a house, unfortunately, which had a fire a few years ago. And there's no better entertainment for neighborhood children and some adults as well than to stand watching the fire engines and the whole matzav and the house burning. And one of the neighbors came out, I was just outside myself, and I heard the neighbor, he said, such a thing, he says, children, he says, go away. It's not nice to look at somebody else's loss. It was it says so sweetly, beautifully. Wasn't screaming, get away from it, whatever. Just put it over so nicely. Generally, a certain sneers. Don't look at a person's loss. Don't look at a person's gain either in an inappropriate way. And if you want to see the ultimate in the damage that can be caused by visually alone, the second part of source number 12 refers to the famous episode of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his son Reb Elazar, who spent 12 years in the cave hiding from Roman oppression. And when they came out of that cave, Nofka, they came out of the cave, they saw people plowing and sowing. Oma, and with a critical eye, they said, can they forsake eternal life and engage instead in just transitory temporal activity? Wherever their eyes came to rest was immediately consumed by fire. So you see that there is a concept that through the gaze of the eye alone, Toiv Ein Yevorach, we said at the very beginning from Mishnah, a goodly eye can create great things. A wrongly focused or uncontrolled, inconsidered gaze can create real physical damage. The Gemara goes on to say that Kodesh Baruch Hu, Baskal was telling them, is you've come out to your cave to destroy my world, go back into your cave. They had to be there another year till they learned to come out. And at that point, Rebbe Elazar was still destroying stuff with his eyes, and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai had learned how to control it and healed any place that was smitten by Rebbe Elazar. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was able to heal it. But anyway, I just want to bring that down to give you an example of how it is possible for the human eye to actually create physical damage. Now, Gemara in Bava Basra Daf Samach, continuing on, source number 13. And we've only got 6 minutes left, so we may have to speed up a little bit. A person cannot create a new opening to a jointly owned courtyard, neither a door corresponding to opposite a door, nor a window against a window. Hoya cotton, if the window was smaller, Yasin godly can't make it larger. Echod, if it was one window, he can't make it into two. It sounds like the Hampstead Garden Suburb Trust here a little bit, Lahavdil. You've got to be very careful about what you do in certain areas, and you've got to make sure you've got your building regs and your planning commission, everything else in place. That's everywhere, but certain trusts are even more fussy in particular. Minohani Mili, where do we know these dinim from? Where do the Gemara learn from? Where did the Mishnah learn from these dinim about not putting a door facing a door, a window facing a window? This is learned from a pasuk in Parashas Balak. Rabbi Yochanan the pasuk says, "Vayis Bilam esino vayayisro sheichin nishvatov." Bilam lifted up his eyes and he saw the people encamped according to their tribes. Ma ra, the last lines, second to last and last line of source 13. What did he see? Ra shein pischei halein mechuvon zelozeh. He saw that the people, the Jewish people, when they camped in the wilderness, were particular not to set up their tents in such a way that their front doors and their windows opened out onto one another. Omar said, these people are deserving of the divine presence resting upon them. People who have such an innate, inherent, natural sense of tznius, of modesty, deserve the divine presence resting upon them. However, in source number 14, very interesting thing. What happens if I've got a window in a wall, an external wall? My neighbor, my friend comes and he buys a parcel of land adjacent to my land. Then the person's bought the courtyard can't say to Balachon, "Stom chalon zeh, close your window off, kadesh lo tabit, because I don't want you to look at me." For the Balachon, the person to whom the window belongs, he has got established precedent for using and being able to benefit from this damage. But it's still called hezek zeh, it's still called a damage. It's a permitted damage, but you cannot argue with the fact that overlooking someone else's property is considered to be a source of damage. Now, In the last two sources, we're going back to Psukim in the Torah, having looked at some of the halachic implications of Hezek Re'iyah, of damage by looking at things, by gazing upon things, and understand that this is a matter of some consequence, and one needs to be particular about it. And people who live their lives by Twitter and all the other social media that I don't even begin to understand, I mentioned before, should be aware that they're living a very dangerous life, a very hollow life. Really, the inner life of the inner soul is far more important. So we're told in the Apostle at the end of Shlach L'chol Bamidbar Tesvav, Lo Yisosuru Achrei Devavkem Achrei Nechem Asher Temzorim Achrem. You need to be careful not to explore after your heart and after your eyes, after which you stray. Says Rashi there famously, Alev V'einayim Emrakli Maguf. The heart and the eyes are like spies for the body. Masar Simleis Haveris. They conjure up the Averis for a person. Ha'ayin Roya, the eye sees. Halev Chomed, the heart desires. V'aguf Eises Haveris, and the body does the sins. Medrash Tanchuma. But I've raised a question there at the end of source 15. The Pasuk itself says, Levav, lo yisasur levavchem b'achrei nechem. It's heart, then eyes, then deed. And yet Rashi says that the Lev V'einayim is the eye, and the eye sees, the heart desires, and then you perform the action. So what comes first? Does the heart drive the eye, or the eye drive the heart? That's hearts leading eyes, or eyes leading hearts. Source number 15. And here we see something very interesting in source 16, with which we conclude the shir. Miketz Nosam Yomim, in Parshas, beginning of Parshas Miketz, it's at the end of exactly 2 years. Paro is dreaming. He's standing by the river. The Medrash there says, Rabbi Yochanan, Harushoy Miskaimin al Eloheihem. The evil, they stand over their gods. Uparo Cholem, Paros, they're dreaming. The Nile, the river, was the god of the Egyptians, its deity. And yet he's standing over it. He's telling his river what to do. Tzadikim, but righteous people, their God is the one who stands over them. As it says about Yaakov Avinu, for example, with the ladder, we'll read in a few weeks' time, behold, Hashem was standing upon that ladder when Vayetz Yaakov Beersheba, and he has that famous dream. There's a phrase the sages say, Tzadikim libam birshusam. The righteous, their hearts are within their control. They control their hearts. The heart is the key driver. But then we work on autopilot. That's what Rashi's telling us. How practically does it work when you see something that you shouldn't see, and you lust for it, you want it, you go after it, and then you sin? That is eye, heart, action. Mirror, signal, maneuver. The same sort of idea. Eye, heart, action. But actually what's driving the eye is the heart itself. And therefore we have to understand how powerful vision is, what a powerful tool and medium it is, to see or not to see. And we have to know that we have a right and a duty not always to see. Because sometimes seeing, even more so looking, and in particular gazing, can be damaging to ourselves if we're not on the appropriate level to deserve to be able to gaze, and can also be damaging to the interests of others where neighborly relations, where societal relations are concerned. It's always good to be interested in everyone else, but you've also got to allow people space, and you've got to allow them the opportunity to grow. And that is the delicate balance between to see or not to see. That indeed is a question which is essential to our Avodas Hashem, to our divine service, to the way we will develop as people, to the way that society will develop around us. I hardly need to go through with you the litany of concerns which we daven at the moment, whether it is an end to the awful pandemic and its consequential knock-on effects, whether it is the world situation security-wise, politically-wise, economically-wise, how much there is. It's so important that we shouldn't be blown off course, and that we should realize that the Torah about which we say, and with this I conclude, V'ho er eineinu b'serosecho, our eyes should be lit up, the eyes should be driven through your Torah, and our hearts should cleave to your mitzvahs. And in that way, please God, we will be able to determine correctly what to see, what not to see. And as that beautiful pasuk in Tehillim says, as the supreme template and example set by David HaMelech says, see in the good of Yerushalayim all the days of your life, may you see children's children healthy, well, and happy and successful in every possible way. Shalom al Yisrael, peace upon Klal Yisrael. So I will just try and unmute everybody for the end of the shir. A few notes in the chat. Can I make the screen bigger? Sorry, Dov, I wasn't able to do that in time for you. Can't see if there's anything else there in the chat that we need to address. I will try and unmute just for the last minute or two if there are any questions or anything that you would like to be able to do. I'm allowing you to be able to speak now. So if anyone wants to raise any questions, feel free to unmute yourself. Oh, Jack, nice to see you all the way from Israel. Jack Samad, how are you? Good to see you. You can unmute yourself, Jack, if you wish to do so. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good to see you, Rabbi Ginsbury.
Thank you, Jack. Nice to see you. Looking very well. Bli Ein Hora.
Thank you.
Good.
Thank
you.
you.
See you. Regards to Rebecca, how's she doing? All right?
Thank God, she's fine. Yeah.
Good. Okay. All right.
Shema Ginsbury.
Sorry, David.
The midrash about Avram being raised above the stars, is that suggesting that in order to discern the truth properly, you have to be above and outside of what's going on?
I don't know. I just learned the medrash as far as Avram Avinu is concerned, and just learn the lessons as we try to learn them from that particular episode. The idea of Vayotze Chutza, that idea of what habota means. I just simply defining habota, what habota means. Yeah. Anything else?
Rabbi.
Yes, Dov.
Rabbi.
Yes, Dov.
We wanted to ask about the recording from your share.
Yes.
Can you send it to whoever wants to listen to your recording?
Yeah, it should be available hopefully on our YouTube site. I think that's something which Rabbi Portman is going to